I came home from work on a frigid January afternoon in Boulder, Colorado, to find my garage door wide open and my entire snow shovel collection gone. Not just any shovels. These weren't the cheap plastic things you grab at Home Depot for $20. I'm talking about vintage, rare and custom-made snow removal tools that I'd been collecting for the past 15 years. Each piece in my collection represented hours of research, travel to estate sales across the country, and significant financial investment. The crown jewel was an 1890s wooden grain shovel from Vermont that had cost me $42,000 at auction. Yes, you read that right. $42,000 for a shovel. I stood there in my driveway, staring at the empty space where my climate-controlled display cases used to be, feeling my blood pressure rise with each passing second. My neighbor, old Mr. Peterson, was outside salting his walkway and gave me a sympathetic look. "They came about 2 hours ago," he said, shuffling over. "That HOA woman, the new president, Brenda something, had a truck and everything, said something about unauthorized storage and community standards." "Brenda Pemberton," I muttered, already pulling out my phone. "Did she have a warrant?" "Any paperwork?" Mr. Peterson shrugged. "She had a clipboard. Looked official enough, I guess. Didn't think much of it until I saw them loading up all your equipment. Seemed like a lot of fuss over some shovels." Some shovels. If only he knew. I'd tried explaining my collection to neighbors before, but most people just didn't understand. To them, a shovel was a tool. To me, each piece was a work of art, a slice of history, an investment that had appreciated considerably over the years. I called Brenda's number, which was listed on the HOA website. She answered on the third ring, her voice dripping with that particular brand of self-righteousness that only an HOA president could muster. "Brenda Pemberton speaking. This is Connor Nash from 4425 Pinecrest Drive. You broke into my garage and stole my property." "Mr. Nash, I did no such thing. I enforced HOA Regulation 47B, which clearly states that garages must be used primarily for vehicle storage, not for commercial enterprises or hoarding situations." My jaw clenched. Commercial enterprises. Hoarding? That's my personal collection, and you had no right to enter my property without permission. Actually, per the HOA covenant you signed when you purchased your home, the association has the right to inspect and remediate any violations that impact community standards. Your garage was visible from the street when you left it open last week, and multiple neighbors have complained about the excessive clutter. Where are my shovels, Brenda? They've been disposed of according to protocol. You can file an appeal with the board, but I should warn you that the next meeting isn't until March. Disposed of. What does that mean exactly? That's not really your concern anymore, Mr. Nash. I suggest you use this as an opportunity to declutter and get your property into compliance. Good day. She hung up. I stood there, phone still pressed to my ear, trying to process what had just happened. Disposed of. She disposed of over $500,000 worth of collectibles because she thought they were junk. I immediately called my lawyer, Tom Richardson, who had kept on retainer specifically for dealing with this nightmare HOA. Brenda had been elected president 6 months ago and had been on a power trip ever since, citing obscure regulations and threatening fines for the most ridiculous infractions. Last month, she tried to fine the Martinez family for having the wrong shade of beige on their mailbox. The month before, she'd attempted to ban children from playing in their own front yards after 3 p.m. because it was disruptive to the peaceful enjoyment of the community. "Tom, she stole my collection," I said the moment he answered. "Slow down. Start from the beginning." I explained everything while pacing my driveway. Tom listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. He was good at his job, methodical and thorough. Okay, first thing, file a police report immediately. This is theft, plain and simple. The HOA covenant doesn't give her the right to seize and dispose of personal property without due process. Second, I need you to document everything. Photos of the empty garage, any receipts or authentication papers you have for the collection, statements from Mr. Peterson. Can you get me a list of every item that was taken with approximate values? I have detailed records. Insurance photos, purchase receipts, appraisals. Everything. Good. What are we talking about in terms of total value? Last appraisal was about $600,000. Some pieces have probably appreciated since then. Tom let out a low whistle. Jesus, Connor, I knew you collected shovels, but I didn't realize we were talking about that kind of money. Most people don't. That's the problem. I drove to the Boulder Police Department and filed a report with Officer Martinez, a young woman who tried very hard to keep a straight face when I explained what had been stolen. Snow shovels, she repeated, pen poised over her notepad. Antique and custom snow shovels, yes, valued at approximately $600,000. That got her attention. $600,000. I pulled out my phone and showed her the insurance documentation and photos. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through the images and appraisals. I'm going to need to call my sergeant, she said. Sergeant Williams came out, a heavy-set man in his 50s with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen it all. He looked at my documentation, asked several questions, and finally nodded. We'll send officers to the HOA president's address. Do you know where she might have taken the items? She said they'd been disposed of. I have no idea what that means. We'll find out. This is definitely theft, possibly felony theft given the value. Give us a few hours. I drove home and started going through my records, preparing everything Tom would need. Each shovel in my collection had its own file with purchase information, provenance, condition reports, and appraisal documents. The 1890s Vermont grain shovel. The custom titanium mountain rescue shovel, designed by a famous industrial designer, one of only 5 ever made. The ceremonial silver shovel used at a groundbreaking for the Empire State Building. The prototype avalanche shovel from the 1960s that had belonged to a legendary ski patrol director. People thought I was crazy when I started this collection. My ex-wife certainly had. She'd left me partially because of it, claiming I cared more about shovels than our marriage. Maybe she'd been right, but these weren't just tools to me. They represented human ingenuity, the ways we'd adapted to harsh winters, the evolution of design and materials. Each one told a story. My phone rang. Officer Martinez. Mr. Nash, we're at Miss Pemberton's residence. She's refusing to tell us where the items are located. Says she doesn't have to cooperate with what she's calling harassment. We're getting a warrant, but I wanted to ask if you have any idea where she might have taken them. Storage unit, dump, anything? I thought hard. The HOA has a storage facility on Industrial Boulevard. They keep maintenance equipment there. She might have taken them there. Address? I gave it to her and then sat down heavily on my couch. This couldn't be happening. I'd been so careful with my collection, kept everything secure and documented. The garage had climate control to prevent rust and degradation. Some of those pieces were irreplaceable. Even if I got insurance money, I'd never find another Vermont grain shovel like mine. 2 hours later, my doorbell rang. It was Sergeant Williams and Officer Martinez, and their expressions told me everything I needed to know before they said a word. Mr. Nash, we located your property. Thank God. Where was it? The county landfill. My stomach dropped. What, miss? Pemberton had them taken directly to the landfill this morning. She signed the disposal order herself. We spoke to the landfill manager, and they were able to locate the load in question. The good news is that most of your collection appears to be intact. The bad news is that some items sustained damage during disposal. I felt dizzy. I need to see them. We've secured them as evidence. Once we've completed our investigation and documentation, you'll be able to recover them. Miss Pemberton has been arrested for theft, criminal mischief, and unlawful disposal of property. Given the value involved, these are felony charges. She's arrested. Right now, she's being processed as we speak. She's not taking it well. Kept saying you had junk in your garage and that she was well within her rights as HOA president. Officer Martinez added. She also said, and I quote, "They're just shovels. They're probably worth $50 total at a yard sale." Under different circumstances, I might have laughed. Instead, I just felt hollow. When can I see my collection? Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Come to the evidence facility on Canyon Boulevard. Bring your documentation so we can verify everything. They left, and I immediately called Tom to update him. She threw them in a landfill. Tom sounded incredulous. That's beyond stupid. That's criminally negligent at minimum. We're going to own her house when this is done. I just want my collection back. Oh, you'll get it back. And you'll get compensation for any damage, legal fees, emotional distress, and probably punitive damages on top of it. The HOA's insurance company is going to lose their minds when they hear about this. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my shovels buried under trash, the vintage wood possibly warping from moisture, the silver tarnishing, the custom pieces scratched and dented. Each one had meant something to me. The months or years I'd spent tracking them down, the excitement of finally acquiring them, the satisfaction of preserving a piece of history. The next morning, I arrived at the evidence facility at 8:45 with 3 file boxes of documentation. Officer Martinez met me and led me to a large room where my collection had been laid out on tables. My heart sank when I saw them. The Vermont grain shovel had a crack running down the handle. The silver ceremonial shovel was severely tarnished and had a dent in the blade. The titanium rescue shovel had deep scratches across its surface. Several others showed signs of damage, dirt ground into the wood, bent handles, chipped paint on the vintage metal pieces. "I'm sorry, Mr. Nash," Officer Martinez said quietly. "We got there as fast as we could." I walked along the tables, taking photos, comparing each piece to my documentation. Out of 47 shovels in my collection, 31 had sustained some level of damage. Some could be restored. Others were permanently diminished in value. The Vermont grain shovel, my most prized piece, would never be the same. The crack was structural. Even with professional restoration, it had lost at least half its value. "We'll need you to provide damage assessments for the investigation," Officer Martinez said. "The DA wants to make sure the charges reflect the full extent of the crime. I'll get my appraiser out here today if possible." I spent 3 hours going through everything, documenting every scratch, dent, and break. My hands shook as I handled pieces I'd cared for so meticulously, now damaged because someone thought they knew better, thought they had the authority to destroy what they didn't understand. Gerald Franklin, my appraiser, arrived around noon. He was a specialist in antique tools and collectibles, a man in his 70s who'd been in the business for 50 years. When he saw the collection spread out on the tables, he actually gasped. "Connor, what happened?" I explained while he examined each piece, making notes, taking photos, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief or dismay. "The grain shovel," he said finally, holding it carefully. "This crack is devastating. I'd appraise this at $42,000. Current value may be $20,000 if you find the right buyer. Even with restoration, we're looking at severe depreciation. He went through each damaged piece, providing updated valuations. When he finished, he looked at me gravely. Total loss in value, accounting for restoration costs, approximately $275,000. Some pieces can be brought back to near original condition, but others, like the grain shovel, are permanently impaired. I felt sick. $275,000 in damage because Brenda Pemberton thought she was enforcing community standards. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings. Tom filed a civil lawsuit against Brenda personally and the HOA for the full amount of damages, plus legal fees, emotional distress, and punitive damages. The HOA's insurance company initially tried to deny the claim, arguing that Brenda had acted outside the scope of her authority. But Tom pointed out that she'd used her position as president to gain access to my property and had claimed she was enforcing HOA rules. The criminal case moved forward simultaneously. The DA assigned a prosecutor named Rebecca Chen, who took the case seriously once she understood the scope of the theft. "This is one of the most bizarre cases I've handled," she told me at our first meeting, "but it's also one of the clearest. She admitted to taking your property. She admitted to disposing of it. She just didn't think she was committing a crime. What's she looking at for charges? Felony theft, felony criminal mischief, possibly burglary since she entered your garage without permission. We're talking potentially 8 to 12 years if convicted on all counts, though I doubt a judge would max out the sentence for a first-time offender. More likely, we're looking at probation, restitution, and community service." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for March. In the meantime, I had to deal with the HOA board, who were frantically trying to distance themselves from Brenda's actions. The vice president, a reasonable man named Carl Jenkins, called me personally. "Connor, I want you to know that the board had no knowledge of what Brenda was planning. We never authorized her to enter your property or remove anything. We're calling for an emergency election to remove her as president." "That's great, Carl, but it doesn't fix my collection." I know. The HOA's insurance should cover this, but if they don't, we'll work something out." "This should never have happened." "You're right. It shouldn't have." The local news picked up the story and it went viral almost immediately. HOA president throws away $600,000 snow shovel collection, ran on every major news outlet. I did a few interviews, mostly to get the word out about the absurd overreach of HOA powers. The response was overwhelming. Other people came forward with their own HOA horror stories. A man in Florida whose HOA had killed his prize orchids because they attracted bees. A woman in Texas whose HOA had her vintage car towed because it was too old, despite being worth more than any board member's vehicle. Brenda, for her part, gave one disastrous interview to a local news station where she doubled down on her position. I was doing my job as HOA president. Mr. Nash was violating community standards. Those shovels were an eyesore and a hoarding situation. I had every right to address it. The reporter pressed her. But these weren't ordinary shovels. They were valuable antiques. A shovel is a shovel. You use it to move snow. Keeping 47 of them in your garage is ridiculous. He could have been parking his car there. Mr. Nash says some of these shovels were worth tens of thousands of dollars. Brenda actually laughed. Then Mr. Nash is delusional. Nobody pays that kind of money for a shovel. That clip alone probably sealed her fate. The comments section exploded with people calling her ignorant, power-hungry, and worse. Several people posted examples of expensive collectibles to prove that just because you don't understand something doesn't mean it lacks value. I got my collection back in early February after the evidence processing was complete. I'd had a restoration specialist on standby, and we immediately began the painstaking work of repairing what could be repaired. Some pieces came back beautifully. Others would never be the same. The Vermont grain shovel hurt the most. Even after restoration, the crack was visible, the wood's integrity compromised. What had been a museum-quality piece was now merely a damaged antique. The preliminary hearing came in mid-March. I attended, sitting in the gallery while Rebecca Chen presented the evidence. Brenda's lawyer, a young public defender who looked overwhelmed, tried to argue that she believed she was acting within her authority as HOA president. "Your Honor, Miss." Pemberton genuinely thought she was enforcing community rules. There was no criminal intent. Judge Morrison, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, cut him off. "Counsel, ignorance of the law is not a defense." "Miss." Pemberton entered Mr. Nash's property without permission, seized items that didn't belong to her, and destroyed property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The fact that she thought she had the right to do so doesn't change the criminal nature of her actions. I'm binding this over for trial. Brenda looked shocked, as if she'd expected the judge to agree with her. Her lawyer tried to whisper something to her, but she shook him off. "Your Honor, those were shovels. Shovels. He was hoarding them in his garage. I had complaints from neighbors." Judge Morrison fixed her with a stern look. "Miss Pemberton, I strongly suggest you listen to your attorney and refrain from speaking. You're not helping your case." The trial was set for June. In the meantime, the civil case moved forward. Tom had filed for summary judgment, arguing that there was no factual dispute about what had happened, only the question of damages. The HOA's insurance company finally agreed to cover the claim after Tom threatened to add them as defendants for bad faith denial. They offered $300,000 in settlement. Tom advised me to take it. We could get more at trial, but trials are unpredictable. This covers your documented losses plus a reasonable amount for emotional distress. We can still pursue additional punitive damages from Brenda personally if you want. What's she even worth? She and her husband own their house, which has about $200,000 in equity. She works as a medical billing specialist, makes about $50,000 a year. He's an accountant, makes maybe $70,000. They're not wealthy, but they're not judgment-proof either. I thought about it. Part of me wanted to pursue everything I could get to make her understand the full weight of what she'd done. But another part just wanted it over. Take the settlement from the insurance company. Let's see what happens at the criminal trial before we decide about pursuing her personally. We settled with the insurance company in April. $300,000 deposited into my account, less Tom's fees. It didn't make up for the damage to pieces that couldn't be fully restored, but it was something. The HOA held their emergency election and removed Brenda as president. Carl Jenkins took over and immediately started working on reforming the association's rules. He actually came to my house to apologize in person. "Connor, I'm so sorry about all of this. The board is voting next week to add provisions that require actual due process before the HOA can take any enforcement action. No more unilateral decisions by the president. Everything has to go through the full board with proper notice to homeowners." "That's good, Carl, but it doesn't help me." "I know. For what it's worth, I think Brenda was completely out of line. I collect vintage radios myself. I get it. Not everyone understands why certain things have value to collectors." After he left, I went into my garage, now restored to its original purpose as a climate-controlled display space. Most of my shovels were back in place, though several spots remained empty where pieces were still being restored. The Vermont grain shovel sat in its case, the crack visible even from a distance. Every time I looked at it, I felt a mix of anger and sadness. The criminal trial started on a hot June morning. The courthouse was in downtown Boulder, a modern building that somehow still felt oppressive with its heavy security and sterile corridors. I'd been subpoenaed to testify, so I waited in the witness room while the prosecution presented their opening arguments. When I was finally called, I walked into the courtroom to find it surprisingly full. Apparently, the case had attracted attention. Several news reporters sat in the gallery, along with what looked like HOA reform activists, given their T-shirts that said things like "End HOA tyranny" and "My home, my rules." Rebecca Chen led me through my testimony methodically. I explained my collection, how I'd acquired each piece, what they meant to me, their value. I described coming home to find my garage empty, my conversation with Brenda, the horror of learning my collection had been thrown in a landfill. "Mr. Nash, can you explain to the jury why these shovels were worth so much money?" Rebecca asked. "Each piece in my collection represents something unique." The Vermont grain shovel from 1890, for example, was hand-carved from a single piece of ash wood by a master craftsman named Elijah Morrison. Only a handful of his pieces still exist. The craftsmanship, the historical significance, the rarity, all of that contributes to value. It's the same reason people collect vintage cars or antique furniture. These aren't just tools, they're artifacts. Brenda's lawyer, the public defender whose name I'd learned was Mark Stevens, cross-examined me. "Mr. Nash, you stored these valuable items in your garage, correct?" "Yes, in a climate-controlled display with security measures. But the garage door was sometimes open, occasionally when I was working in there or coming and going, and neighbors could see inside, if they looked, yes." "Did you ever think that storing 47 shovels in your garage might seem excessive to your neighbors?" "I didn't care what it seemed like to my neighbors. It was my property, my garage, my collection. But you understand that Miss Pemberton received complaints. That doesn't give her the right to steal my property and throw it away." Mark tried a few more questions, but he wasn't making much headway. The facts were too clear. Brenda had taken my property without permission and destroyed it. No amount of arguing about whether I should have kept my collection in my garage changed that. The prosecution called several other witnesses. Officer Martinez testified about finding the collection at the landfill. Gerald Franklin explained the value and damage. Mr. Peterson testified about seeing Brenda and a truck at my house. The landfill manager confirmed receiving the disposal order from Brenda. When Brenda took the stand in her own defense, I could see the jury's skepticism before she even spoke. She was a woman in her early 50s, with the kind of sharp features and tight expression that suggested chronic disapproval. She wore a conservative navy suit that looked like she'd bought it specifically for court. Mark Stevens walked her through her version of events carefully, trying to establish that she genuinely believed she was acting within her authority. "Miss Pemberton, why did you decide to remove Mr. Nash's shovels from his garage?" "I received multiple complaints from neighbors about the excessive clutter visible in his garage. As HOA president, it's my responsibility to maintain community standards. The covenant clearly states that garages should be used primarily for vehicle storage." "Did you inspect the shovels before ordering their removal?" "I looked in the garage, yes. It was full of old shovels, some of them rusting, all of them taking up space. It looked like a hoarding situation." "Did you believe these shovels had significant value?" "Of course not. They were shovels. Old, used shovels. I assumed they were worth maybe $50 or $100 for the lot." "What did you intend to do with them?" "I ordered them disposed of as junk. I thought I was doing Mr. Nash a favor, honestly. helping him clear out his garage so he could use it properly. Rebecca Chen's cross-examination was brutal. "Miss Pemberton, did you contact Mr. Nash before entering his property?" "No, but the covenant gives the HOA the right to inspect and remediate violations. Did you get permission from the full HOA board before taking this action?" Brenda hesitated. "I'm the president. I have the authority to make decisions on behalf of the board." "That's not what I asked. Did you get approval from the board?" "No, but I didn't need it." "Did you attempt to research whether these shovels might have value before throwing them away?" "Why would I? They were shovels." "So you made an assumption based on your personal opinion that shovels couldn't be valuable?" "Yes, because it's common sense. Shovels are tools. They're not collectibles." Rebecca pulled out her laptop and displayed an image on the courtroom screen. It was a news article about a rare baseball card selling for millions. "Miss Pemberton, are you aware that people collect many different things? Baseball cards, comic books, vintage lunch boxes, all items that to some might seem like they shouldn't be worth much, but to collectors are extremely valuable, I suppose, but that's different." "How is it different? Those are actual collectibles. Shovels are just tools." "Who decides what's a collectible and what's just a tool?" Brenda didn't have a good answer for that. She stumbled through a few more questions before Rebecca moved in for the kill. "Miss Pemberton, after Mr. Nash called you and told you those shovels were valuable, what did you do?" "I told him they'd been disposed of." "Did you attempt to recover them?" "No, they were already gone." "Did you call the landfill to see if they could be retrieved?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I still believed I'd done the right thing. I thought he was lying about the value to try to get me in trouble." "So even after being informed that you destroyed valuable property, you did nothing to mitigate the damage?" "I did what I thought was right as HOA president." Rebecca turned to the jury. "No further questions." The closing arguments were straightforward. Rebecca argued that Brenda had committed theft and criminal mischief by intentionally taking and destroying property that didn't belong to her. Mark Stevens argued that Brenda had made a mistake based on a good faith interpretation of her authority, but you could see from the jury's faces that they weren't buying it. The jury deliberated for just under 3 hours before returning with a verdict: guilty on all counts. Brenda's face went white. Her husband, sitting in the gallery, put his head in his hands. Judge Morrison set sentencing for 4 weeks later. "I felt a strange mix of vindication and emptiness as I left the courthouse. Justice had been served, but it didn't bring back my collection in its original condition. The Vermont grain shovel would always have that crack. The silver ceremonial shovel would never shine quite the same way. Some pieces were restored beautifully, but others bore the permanent marks of Brenda's ignorance and arrogance." The sentencing hearing came on a gray morning in July. I attended, sitting in the gallery while various people made statements. Rebecca Chen asked for significant prison time given the severity of the theft and Brenda's complete lack of remorse. Mark Stevens pleaded for probation, arguing that Brenda had no criminal history and posed no danger to the community. Judge Morrison listened to everything before speaking. "Miss Pemberton, please stand. I've presided over many cases in my time on the bench, but I must say, this one stands out for the sheer arrogance and willful ignorance you displayed. You took it upon yourself to decide that Mr. Nash's property had no value because you personally didn't understand why anyone would collect shovels. You didn't do research. You didn't seek expert opinions. You didn't even contact Mr. Nash to discuss your concerns. You simply took what wasn't yours and destroyed it. What's particularly troubling is your continued insistence that you did nothing wrong. Even after learning the true value of what you destroyed, even after Mr. Nash's devastation was made clear to you, You showed no remorse. You stood by your actions. That demonstrates a fundamental lack of respect for other people's property and rights. However, I also note that you have no criminal history. This appears to be an aberration driven by an inflated sense of authority rather than criminal intent in the traditional sense. Therefore, I'm sentencing you to 5 years in prison, suspended after 18 months, followed by 3 years of probation. You will also pay restitution in the full amount of damages, which I calculate at $275,000 based on the expert testimony at trial. Additionally, you will perform 500 hours of community service and are prohibited from holding any position of authority in any homeowners association for the next 10 years. Brenda's knees buckled. Her lawyer caught her. 18 months in prison. It seemed both too much and not enough. After the sentencing, reporters caught me on the courthouse steps. "Mr. Nash, how do you feel about the verdict and sentence?" "I feel like justice has been partially served. Miss Pemberton is being held accountable for what she did. But no amount of prison time or restitution will fully restore what was lost. Some of those pieces were irreplaceable. You think this case will lead to HOA reform? I hope so. HOAs need oversight. They need checks and balances. No one person should have the authority to make unilateral decisions that impact other people's property and lives. What happened to me could happen to anyone living under an HOA." The interview aired that evening on the local news, and once again, the story went viral. State legislators in Colorado started talking about HOA reform bills. Other states followed. The national conversation about HOA overreach reached a fever pitch. As for me, I went home to my restored collection. I'd used some of the insurance settlement to acquire a few new pieces, though nothing could truly replace the Vermont grain shovel in its original condition. I'd also invested in better security and made sure my garage door was never left open where Brenda's potential successors might see inside and get ideas. Carl Jenkins and the reformed HOA board left me alone. They'd implemented new rules requiring board approval for any enforcement actions, mandatory notice periods, and an appeals process. It was a start, though I no longer trusted any HOA to act reasonably. Brenda reported to the county jail in August to begin serving her sentence. I didn't attend. There was nothing to gain from watching her be taken into custody. She'd lost her position, her reputation, her freedom, and would be paying restitution for years. That was enough. About 6 months into her sentence, I received a letter. It was from Brenda, written on prison stationery in careful handwriting. "Mr. Nash, I've had a lot of time to think about what I did to you. My lawyer told me not to contact you, but I feel like I need to say this. I was wrong. Not just wrong about the value of your collection, though I was certainly wrong about that. I was wrong about everything. I had no right to take your property. I had no right to make decisions about what you kept in your garage. I let the power of being HOA president go to my head, and I convinced myself that enforcing rules was more important than respecting people's rights and property. I'm sorry for what I did to your collection. I'm sorry for the damage I caused. I know this apology doesn't fix anything, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand how badly I wronged you." I read the letter 3 times, trying to determine if it was genuine or just an attempt to look good for her parole hearing. In the end, I decided it didn't matter. The damage was done. An apology, however sincere, couldn't restore the Vermont grain shovel or undo the violation of having my property seized and destroyed. I filed the letter away and went back to my life. The civil case against Brenda personally settled before trial. Her lawyer approached Tom with an offer. She'd agree to a judgment of $100,000, payable over 20 years, in exchange for not going to trial. Tom advised me that it was probably the best we'd get without spending more money on legal fees than we'd recover. "She's going to be paying you about $400 a month for the next 2 decades, Tom said. "Not a fortune, but it's something, and it'll be a constant reminder of what she did." I accepted the settlement. Adding another $100,000 to what I'd already recovered didn't make me whole, but it was close. More importantly, it meant Brenda would be paying for her actions for a very long time. Life slowly returned to normal. My collection continued to grow, though I was more cautious now about what I displayed and how visible it was. I started giving talks about collecting and the importance of understanding value before making judgments. Several museums expressed interest in exhibiting my collection, and I loaned out pieces for shows about the history of winter tools and snow removal. The Vermont grain shovel, despite its damage, remained the centerpiece of my collection. I'd had a special plaque made for its display case. 1890 Vermont grain shovel by Elijah Morrison. Survived 130 years of use and storage only to be damaged by ignorance and arrogance in 2025. A reminder that value isn't always obvious, and power without wisdom is dangerous. People who visited my collection always stopped at that piece and read the plaque. Many asked about the story. I'd tell them, watching their expressions shift from curiosity to disbelief to anger on my behalf. "Did she really throw a $40,000 shovel in the garbage?" they'd ask. "She threw 47 shovels worth over $600,000 in the garbage," I'd correct them. "She thought she was throwing away junk." The HOA reform movement gained real traction. Colorado passed legislation requiring HOAs to provide due process before taking enforcement actions, limiting the ability of individual board members to make unilateral decisions, and creating penalties for HOAs that violated homeowners' rights. Other states followed with similar laws. It wouldn't prevent all HOA abuses, but it was a step in the right direction. I got updates occasionally about Brenda. She was released after serving her full 18 months, having apparently not impressed the parole board enough for early release. She and her husband had to sell their house to make the restitution payments, moving to a small apartment outside Boulder. She found work in medical billing again, though not at the same company where she'd worked before. Her wages were being garnished for restitution payments to me and to cover court costs and fines. Part of me felt bad for her. 18 months in prison and 20 years of payments seemed like a heavy price for what had essentially been a monumentally stupid mistake driven by ego and ignorance. But then I'd look at the crack in my Vermont grain shovel or the scratches on the titanium rescue shovel, and the sympathy would fade. She'd had multiple opportunities to stop what she was doing, to question whether she really had the right to seize and destroy someone's property. She'd chosen arrogance instead. 2 years after the incident, I was invited to speak at a national conference on HOA reform in Atlanta. I brought several pieces from my collection, including the damaged Vermont grain shovel, and told my story to an audience of homeowners, lawyers, and legislators. "The thing about HOAs," I said, concluding my talk, "is that they're supposed to serve the community, not rule it. They're supposed to maintain property values and common spaces, not act as petty dictators enforcing personal preferences." What happened to me was extreme, but the underlying problem is common. People get a little bit of power and forget that their neighbors are human beings with rights, not subjects to be controlled. The audience gave me a standing ovation. Afterward, dozens of people came up to share their own HOA horror stories. A man whose HOA had killed his garden because they didn't like the plants he'd chosen. A woman whose HOA had tried to force her to get rid of her therapy dog. A couple who'd been fined thousands of dollars for painting their front door a shade of red that was 3% different from the approved color. Each story reinforced what I'd learned. HOAs attracted a certain type of person who loved having power over others, and without proper checks and balances, that power got abused. My case had been dramatic enough to make national news, but countless smaller abuses happened every day. I kept collecting shovels. My insurance was now properly updated with detailed appraisals and photos. I'd also installed serious security measures, including cameras and reinforced locks. If anyone from the HOA ever came near my garage again without permission, I'd have video evidence and the police on speed dial. My latest acquisition was a custom snow shovel designed by a famous modern artist, one of 10 created for a gallery show about the relationship between tools and art. It cost me $38,000 and it was absolutely worth it. Beautiful design, innovative materials, perfect balance. Some people would look at it and see an expensive shovel. I saw art. I saw human creativity. I saw something worth preserving. That's what Brenda had never understood and probably still didn't. Value isn't just about function. It's about meaning, rarity, craftsmanship, history. A shovel isn't just a tool for moving snow any more than a painting is just canvas and pigment or a violin is just wood and strings. Context matters. Purpose matters. The story behind something matters. I sometimes wondered what Brenda thought about during her time in prison. Did she lie awake at night thinking about the Vermont grain shovel, the crack running through wood that had survived over a century before she got her hands on it? Did she realize that her determination to enforce rules had destroyed something irreplaceable? Or did she still think she'd been right, just unlucky to have crossed someone who happened to collect expensive shovels? I'd never know, and ultimately, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd been held accountable. The criminal justice system had worked. The civil system had worked. The court of public opinion had worked. And maybe, just maybe, my case had helped prevent the same thing from happening to someone else. 3 years after the incident, I received a request from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to make a short film about my collection and what had happened. I agreed, figuring it might help spread awareness about HOA overreach and the importance of respecting other people's property. The film, titled Snow Shovels and Justice, premiered at a small film festival in Denver and won an Audience Choice Award. It featured interviews with me, Tom Richardson, Gerald Franklin, and even Officer Martinez, who'd been the first responder to my theft report. The filmmaker had also gotten footage of the damaged Vermont grain shovel, close-ups of the crack that shouldn't exist. Watching the film was surreal. Seeing my story told by someone else, seeing the damaged pieces on screen, hearing other people talk about what had happened. It made it feel both more real and somehow distant, as if it had happened to someone else. After the premiere, a young woman approached me. She was maybe 25 with nervous energy and a backpack covered in enamel pins. "Mr. Nash, I'm Emma. I just wanted to thank you." "Thank me for what?" "For fighting back. I live in an HOA in Aurora and our president is just like that woman who took your shovels. Total power trip. Always threatening people with fines, always acting like she owns the neighborhood. But after your case, we knew we didn't have to just take it. We organized, got her voted out, and changed our bylaws. Your story inspired us. That meant more to me than any settlement or verdict." The idea that my nightmare had helped someone else stand up to HOA tyranny made the whole ordeal feel worthwhile in a way that money never could. "I'm glad I could help," I told Emma. No one should have to live under a petty dictator just because they own a home. Life continued. Brenda made her monthly payments, though she was often late, resulting in additional penalties. I didn't chase the money aggressively. The point had been made. She was paying the price for what she'd done, financially and otherwise. My collection grew to over 60 pieces. I became more active in the collecting community, helping other people authenticate and appraise their own collections. I wrote articles for collector magazines about preserving vintage tools and understanding their historical context. I even consulted for museums setting up exhibits. The Vermont grain shovel remained the centerpiece of my collection, crack and all. I'd been offered significant money for it, even in its damaged state, from collectors who wanted to own a piece of the story. I always refused. That shovel represented something important to me now. Not just history and craftsmanship, but the importance of standing up for yourself, of not letting people with a little authority push you around. 5 years after the incident, I ran into Carl Jenkins at a local coffee shop. He'd long since stepped down as HOA president, turning the role over to a rotating board to prevent any one person from having too much power. "Connor, hey, how are you? How's the collection?" "Good, Carl, growing." "How's the HOA?" "Quiet, thank God. The new structure is working well." "Everything goes through committee review now. We haven't had a single major dispute in 2 years." "That's great to hear." "I've got to tell you, what happened with Brenda was a wake-up call for all of us. We were so focused on enforcing rules that we forgot why the rules existed in the first place. It's supposed to be about maintaining the community, not controlling it. We talked for a while longer about HOA reform and the changes that had swept through associations across the country. Colorado's new laws had teeth, and HOAs were finally being held accountable for overreach. It was progress, though not enough to prevent all abuses. As I drove home that evening, I thought about how much my life had changed because of one woman's arrogance and ignorance. I'd become an accidental activist for HOA reform. My collection, once a private passion, was now somewhat public, featured in documentaries and articles. I'd met people across the country who'd faced similar situations, and I'd helped some of them fight back. Was it worth it? The stress, the legal battles, the permanent damage to pieces I'd loved. I honestly didn't know. Some days I wished Brenda had just left my garage alone, had been reasonable enough to talk to me before taking action. Other days, I felt grateful that my case had sparked a larger conversation and maybe prevented others from suffering the same fate. What I did know was that I'd never take my collection for granted again. Every piece had meaning, every piece had value, and that value didn't depend on whether Brenda Pemberton or anyone else understood or appreciated it. That was the real lesson. You don't need other people's validation for the things you love and treasure. You just need to protect them from those who can't see their worth. My snow shovel collection sits in my garage today, carefully preserved and protected. Each piece tells a story about innovation and adaptation, about human creativity and problem solving, about the tools we create to thrive in harsh environments. And one piece, the Vermont grain shovel with its visible crack, tells a story about justice, accountability, and the importance of respecting what you don't understand. People still ask me if I regret not settling with Brenda early, if I wish I'd just let it go and moved on. I tell them no. Some things are worth fighting for, not because of money or revenge, but because principles matter. Property rights matter. Standing up to bullies matters, whether those bullies are schoolyard thugs or HOA presidents drunk on a tiny amount of power. Brenda Pemberton threw away $600,000 worth of snow shovels because she thought they were junk. She lost her freedom, her home, her reputation, and will be making payments for the next 15 years because she couldn't imagine that a shovel might be worth more than her car. That's an expensive lesson in humility and the dangers of assumption. As for me, I learned that sometimes the things we treasure most aren't just valuable in dollars and cents. They're valuable because of what they represent, what they mean to us personally. And those are the things worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth standing up to anyone who tries to take them away. My garage door is closed now. The collection is safe, secure, and growing. And somewhere in Colorado, Brenda Pemberton is still paying for the day she thought she knew better. The day she decided that her judgment mattered more than my rights. The day she learned that ignorance and arrogance can be very, very expensive. That's justice, served cold as a Colorado winter, as enduring as an 1890s grain shovel, and as clear as the crack that runs through it.